My name's Travis Alexander. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in medical humanities at Rice University, where I work on the Translational Humanities for Public Health project, led by Dr. Kirsten Auster. We're joined here today by Lee Bessette, who is the Assistant Director for Digital Learning at Georgetown University's Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, or CANDLES. And Dr. Bessette's going to talk to us a little bit today about her work on affective labor, especially as it's undergone some changes and become more salient during the time of COVID. So with that in mind, Dr. Bessette, do you want to introduce a little bit of your work at the CANDLES Center in Georgetown and tell us what your broad research is focused on?
Sure. So I wear a lot of different hats at CANDLES at Georgetown University. I'm primarily working in academic technology, so helping faculty incorporate technology into their teaching. I do a little bit of instructional design as well. I do a little bit of traditional faculty development work in that sort of sense. And of course, as you can imagine, our work at CANDLES generally, and myself and my colleagues' work who work around academic technology, more specifically in instructional design, our roles very much increased during COVID, of course, at the beginning, in this move towards remote learning and moving everything online and having to incorporate academic and instructional technology. Sorry about my dog there. So previous to COVID, I was actually working on editing a book called Affective Labor and Alt-Act Careers, where I put out a call asking about this kind of emotional labor that we as staff were often required to do, but that it wasn't really discussed, it wasn't really recognized, it was either erased or minimized, unspoken. And I just had sent out the manuscript for it, and then COVID hit. Like, we literally I sent the manuscript to the University Press of Kansas, and then COVID hit. And little did I know, of course, at that moment, just how, as you said, salient the work and the research and the writing that I had done on this book to understanding, or having a better understanding and being able to give language to myself and my colleagues around, just why we were so tired. I mean, we were doing the work that we loved, the work that we were good at, in some cases, the work we'd been wanting to do with faculty. Yes, under difficult circumstances, but there's this element of affective or emotional labor that really wore on us, even more so than just the pandemic conditions. Now, emotional or affective labor is defined as managing one's own emotions in order to instill or inspire an appropriate emotional reaction from the person that you're engaging with. Arlie Hochschild, in A Managed Heart in the 80s, came up with this concept of emotional labor in looking specifically at flight attendants. And so there's been a lot of work on emotional and affective labor when it comes to service professions. And again, that idea of service with a smile, of wanting to keep people calm. But it hasn't really been looked at in higher education, and particularly around higher education staff. The exception to that would be libraries, of course, because they were always ahead of the curve on these things. You ever want to know what's next in higher education studies, look at what libraries are saying. And so what we were dealing with as academic technologists, as faculty developers, as instructional designers, was not just the usual level of affective or emotional labor of, trying to ensure that faculty felt comfortable using a new technology despite being nervous or apprehensive. It's a really vulnerable experience to ask faculty to redesign their courses in the best of circumstances. So we already had an experience with this kind of emotional labor that was so important to our work, of having these productive collaborative relationships with faculty or subject matter experts around course design, around assignment design, around pedagogy. But then that just gets turned up to 11 during the pandemic, because the faculty are dealing with the anxiety of their students, they're dealing with their own anxieties, they're dealing with whatever is going on in their own lives. And we're asking them in a lot of cases to, in just about every case really, to very quickly pivot, as we all called it, the great pivot, from doing things the way they had always done them for years, if not decades, and saying, okay, well, now you have to do it over Zoom. Now you have to learn the LMS or Canvas or Blackboard. Now you have to incorporate collaborative technologies. Now you have to basically redesign your entire course. And that's a really difficult position to put the faculty in. But on top of that, we had to project that at a level of expertise, a level of confidence, a level of a level of know-how, in order to, again, be able to have the faculty feel comfortable, right? Managing our own emotions, our own anxieties, our own doubts, our own, everything that comes with the pandemic, our own exhaustion. But we had to remain calm and remain confident, project competence, in order to instill that emotion in the faculty so that they felt that they could do it, that they felt supported in their process, that they didn't despair, that they didn't get overly discouraged. So, there was a lot of anger that we had to deal with from faculty, but there was a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of feelings. While our own feelings, there wasn't as much space for us to process our own, because we had to, maintain that service with a smile. So it became really relevant to talking about just how hard our jobs had become. Because again, yes, it was demanding intellectually, running these workshops, running design studios, running whatever programming we had. But in the running of that programming, again, the amount of emotional labor of managing our own emotions, of helping faculty work through their own emotions, oftentimes as well, that we would be we'd bear the brunt of their frustrations and anger at administrative policies that we had no control over, and that we might not have even agreed with, but we were tasked with implementing them. So we can't really go and undermine that, because again, it undermines the process of trying to help, trying to help our faculty do our best, trying to help our students learn. And so I began writing about it quite publicly in various publications. So I wrote for it's a publication, online publication called EDUCAUSE Review, which is specifically geared towards academic technologists and instructional designers. And then I wrote more generally about it in the Chronicle of Higher Education in a piece called "The Staff Are Not Okay." And it was really amazing, the response that I got, because, again, because it wasn't really talked about in higher education, let alone around staff issues, people didn't have a name for what they were feeling. And so I gave them a name and I gave them language to be able to talk more productively about what they were going through and why what they were going through was so hard and so exhausting in that moment. It also gave them legitimacy, particularly when I published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, to, take the issue to their bosses, the administration, and say, look, this is real, this is a thing, and we need to address this. We need to start having conversations around it, and talking about how important this work is, because if it weren't for affective labor, none of this would be getting done or would have gotten done. But the flip side of that is we need to start acknowledging it. We need to start supporting it. We need to start planning for it, so that, the staff don't burn out. And it really became this important issue for me to talk about and to promote, because again, I'm a literature person too, PhD in comparative literature. I know the power of narrative and the power of language and the power of naming things, and just being able to have the language and to have something named and recognized is such a powerful thing. And it's such a powerful thing to build community around. It's such a powerful thing to empower people to advocate, to self-advocate, to organize. So that became very much a part of my project, is trying to just raise awareness, as much as cliched as that might seem now. And thankfully, the book Affective Labor and Alt-Act Careers is scheduled to come out in March. This was all, of course, it was all written pre-COVID. But again, I think the awareness of it and the urgency of talking about it, of having a language, of having a larger conversation around it, I think is, again, it's more relevant than ever. And so while none of the essays really address COVID-19, all of the issues that all of the authors and contributors talk about didn't go away. They were just amplified as we move through the pandemic. And it's been really interesting too, because I've recorded a kind of promotional / companion podcast, which I'm going to be releasing in the new year with all of the contributors. And one of the questions was, how has COVID-19 impacted what you talk about in your essay? And, to a person, they were all saying, well, it didn't really change anything. It just amplified everything.
I wanted to just follow up briefly. One thing you said towards the beginning of your response that I found so fascinating is that the content of activity that these academic support professionals are doing and undertaking is stuff they love to do. And I wonder if you could talk about the way that that gets used almost against people, that the notion of their passion, or their at least their ostensible passion for these tasks or these routines almost makes invisible the extra demand of it, right? Like, can you talk about the way that the presumption of passion kind of helps to naturalize the demand of extra affective labor?
Oh, definitely. There's actually an entire essay in the collection about this. The whole cult of doing what you love, right? And how, particularly in higher education, it isn't just for staff work, it's for faculty work as well, where there's this idea that it's a vocation, right? And that that passion, and that because we get to do what we love, that it we should be willing to suffer a little for it, to oversimplify. And there's a lot of that. There's the idea of doing what you love. There's also the idea of the psychic wage. Again, the feeling in higher education that you're contributing to something bigger than yourself, be it the mission of the institution, the educations of future generations, all of those kinds of things. And we're seeing it with people leaving, particularly in staff roles in higher education, is that that's not enough anymore, right? That it doesn't stave off burnout, right? It doesn't make burnout go away. It doesn't make the job easier. And in a lot of ways, like you said, it makes it harder, because we are so willing to throw our entire selves into our jobs, right? Because we are doing what we love, because we are devoted to the mission, because we care about our students, right? And so that becomes a way of, again, just contributing to the burnout, because it spirals. It just adds to it. And during the pandemic, we all wanted to do right by our students, right? We all knew everyone was suffering. And so we, a lot of cases, set aside our own suffering for the good of the institution, for the good of our students, for the greater good. And, that it makes it really difficult. It's difficult to pull out of that. It's difficult to say no. It's difficult to set boundaries, all of these things that we need to have in order to have a healthy work-life balance. And, again, this idea that the positive emotions, and this is another essay in the collection, talks about toxic affective labor versus productive affective labor. And, there's a lot of affective labor that we do that is highly productive. Again, nurturing relationships, forging collaborations, all these positive outcomes from seeing, the effective incorporation of technology, good course design, assignment design, right? Those are that kind of emotional labor, and the triumphs are great, but it's that other side of the toxic emotional labor that has a toll. And when we're talking about doing what you love, it becomes really difficult to talk about the more toxic elements of it. And so, again, to be able to have productive conversations, to be able to differentiate between the different kinds or levels of emotional or affective labor that we're doing is really important, because just because it's feelings doesn't make it equal, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So by way of conclusion, I wonder, you mentioned that in the new year, you're going to be putting out this podcast series that's going to, I guess, effectively return to the essays in the book and almost remediate them retrospectively through the experience of COVID. I wonder if you could give us a quick preview of what that podcast will be called, how we can find it, and who's going to be on it.
So it's going to be called Terms of Service, and it will probably be put up on a subdomain on my website. I haven't even set it up yet, but you will probably be able to find it on termsofservice.readywriting.org. And I will be sure to put it on all major podcast distributing platforms, as I do, using an RSS feed. And it will be me interviewing the not all of the contributors, but a majority of the contributors to the edited volume, Affective Labor and Alt-Ac Careers. And I ask everyone the same basic 4 questions. So I ask them, again, who they are and what they do. I ask them for a little bit of the backstory or origin story for their contribution to the book. I asked them about how COVID-19 and the pandemic impacted their work, as well as how they viewed their chapter. And then the last question I asked, which is I think the stinger and maybe the most important one, I asked them, I said, okay, so now what? Right? We've written this book, we've published this book, we're having a conversation around affective labor and staff careers in higher education. Now what? Where do we go from here? What tangible, concrete things do we want to see happen around this subject and topic? And that one was the most challenging one for everyone. But the way we viewed the book and the way I see the podcast, even the work during COVID-19, is these are provocations. This is the start of the conversation, not the end of it, because we want to see change, and we're still trying to figure out what that change is, because there's always a danger, I think, when we talk about something like emotion and emotional labor, is that yes, we want it recognized, we want it acknowledged, we want it supported, but do we want it commodified, right? Do we want it standardized in a way that jobs, HR, job descriptions typically categorize and make it discrete and make it measurable and make it just another thing on a long, ever expanding list of job responsibilities, right? So it's about how do we have a responsible, productive conversation moving forward around the role of affective labor in all of our jobs, and how we can work to productively support it, acknowledge it, without it getting sort of globbed in with all of the other quote unquote job skills. Because one of the other challenges, as you can imagine, is that not everyone practices or has the expectation of practicing affective labor equally, right? So it's when we talk about emotion and emotional work, it's typically a very gendered conversation, right? With the different expectations for men and women. It's also a racialized conversation, for women of color, but for people of color generally, of who is expected to do emotional labor and what kinds of emotional labor they're expected to do. So all of these factors come in, again, making it even more complicated to have these conversations around who is rewarded, what are they rewarded for, how are they rewarded and acknowledged, and how that work also is distributed, right? Who does that work? And is it for lack of a better word, fair? Not that everything is ever going to be 100% fair, but has it been fairly distributed?
All right, well, that sounds great. By way of conclusion, I'll encourage everyone to go out and check out the book out on Kansas of these essays, and then to hear them read backwards through the experience of COVID, to check out Dr. Bessette's podcast series out early next year called Terms of Service. So thanks for stopping by and talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to talk about this.
All right. Well, we'll eagerly watch what happens next in this project.